Hi, my name is Alex Patel, and in this video I want to talk about economics. Specifically, I want to talk about how capital is affecting labor markets in the 21st knowledge economy, and more specifically, I want to talk about the United States and what's going on. Now, the idea of capital affecting labor markets has existed for centuries. Of course, when I talk about capital, I mean any non-financial, basically, thing that helps in production of goods and services. Like a machine that helps drills for oil, something like that. And labor, of course, is using physical labor as a means of production. Um, so usually over history, what we see is that capital replaces more of the lower tier jobs, the menial jobs, and though that does hurt the labor market initially, usually in the mid or long term, everyone kind of gets a better job and it raises the standard of living. However, we see a very different situation in the 21st century. Now, before I want to get into that, for the purpose of this video, I want to classify jobs into three general categories. These are my own categories and they are a bit abstract, but it will help for the purpose of this discussion. So the first category we're just going to call bottom or lower tier. And these are going to be your menial jobs, basic jobs, minimum wage, like waitress, waiter, um, barista, coal miner, very, very basic jobs. This is not to put anyone down, this is just simply for categorical purposes. Then we're going to talk about mid-tier, middle sector jobs, and that's going to be like white collar, working in an office space, things like that. And then, of course, your top tier jobs, like very well paid scientists, CEOs, bankers, doctors, things like that. And the purpose of this is just going to help later on in discussing everything. So over the years, over the centuries, so in the United States, for the most part, capital has taken over the lower tier jobs and kind of pushed everyone into the mid and top tier sections, and that's been good. And though it has hurt in the short run, and there are problems with that, in the mid to long run, as I said, it does get better. But the reason we're seeing such a hard time in the economy right now in the labor market and how capital is affecting that is the way capital is replacing jobs. Because it's not replacing the bottom tier jobs anymore. In today's world, I would argue that what's going on is capital is replacing the mid tier jobs. And that's leading to a big disruption in the labor market because that doesn't usually happen. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I think perhaps undoubtedly the greatest capital that's been created in the late 20th and in the 21st century is technology, and more specifically I want to talk about software. And so as computers are able to do more and software is able to take care of so much, what's happening is the mid-tier jobs are being replaced, your white-collar jobs, not your blue-collar jobs, not your lower tier, but your mid jobs, and even some at the higher levels, your top-tier jobs. So what we see is a massive disruption in the labor market. So first I'm going to describe what's going on. So what happens is that, say I'm a white collar worker, and technically speaking I actually am right now. I work in an office sort of job, so under my categories I would be in the mid-tier section. And what's happening is as these computers are able to do more and more of the computer work that people like me do, people in the mid-tier are losing their jobs. So all these white-collar jobs are going away thanks to software. So what does that happen? It makes the top tier and lower tier far more competitive, as well as the mid-tier, obviously. The mid-tier speaks for itself, as software is taking over more jobs, there's fewer jobs in the middle section. The middle class is usually in the mid-tier, so everyone's trying to compete for that, and that means a lot of people unemployed. And here's how it's affecting the other two sectors. What's happening is now you have someone with a bachelor's, maybe even a master's degree, who used to work in this mid-tier section, now has to look for a job as, say, a barista or a waiter in these lower tier jobs. And they don't want to do that because they worked hard for this education and the skills they have, and now they have to take a job that pays a lot less. But they need a job, so they're going to have to take it. In the meantime, youth, people my age are also trying to get those jobs, trying to get into the workforce, and those jobs are also becoming more competitive because now you have more and more people pushing for that, while at the same time driving down wages because people need them so badly that employers can pay them less. And that's bad because then that's less money that can then subsequently go into stores and buy goods and services, and it makes the economy sluggish as a whole, and the unemployment rate isn't likely to drop anytime soon, only rise or at least stay steady or drop just at slow amounts. But unemployment is still going to be a big problem for the coming years. And so these lower tier jobs are more competitive. Additionally, the higher tier jobs are too. More people are trying to get masters and PhD and get those jobs, and that leads to the higher tier jobs getting more competitive too as people from the mid tier try to reach that. However, for people in the mid tier, it's not as easy to go to the higher tier jobs. I mean, say you're 30, 40, 50, maybe even older, and you already went to college and all that, and you don't have to go back to college again to get another degree or a whole new expertise. And usually those people don't have the experience or whatever to get into these top tier jobs. So it's very hard for them to get those. And so they have to take those either lower tier jobs or get very lucky and find some of the mid tier jobs that are still available. So capital is affecting the labor market in very different ways in the 21st century, in that it's not just taking the lower tier jobs, but it's also hitting the mid tier and some even in the upper tier jobs, which means everyone's basically crawling for a job, and virtually most people have to really push for job security because it's not easy in today's job market. However, at the same time, capital has made productivity more efficient. So I'm going to give some basic prescriptions for how we can compensate for the labor market being disrupted as it is, and how to still have increased productivity, which we've seen increasing for years, while at the same time respecting the rights of workers, and trying to help this unemployment and general economy crisis in the United States and even to some extent around the world. Okay, so here are some basic prescriptions. One is, I would like to introduce a living wage. Now, a living wage is a little different from a minimum wage, in that a living wage compensates for inflation, at least in my definition, and it basically allows, it's just that living wage. It takes into account living standards, things like that, and so you can at least survive. And we're just talking survival right there. And that's different from a minimum wage. A minimum wage is just a minimum wage. It doesn't have to be based on cost standards of living and things like that. So most economic estimates have a living wage in the United States around $11 to $13. So even just a small increase, like even if you just went with a more politically I wouldn't even call 11 politically possible, but even if we raise the wage to $11 an hour, made a living wage, so raise the minimum wage to $11 an hour, that could have a significant positive impact on the economy, because that means even if you get these lower tier jobs, you still have a solid wage. You have more money, which is more you can spend on goods and services, or even in savings and checkings accounts, and it helps the economy overall because you can then use that money to buy things or save it, which has a high multiplier, versus having a less wage and not being able to buy as much, which hurts the economy more. And so a living wage is very good, especially for those working part-time or working in the jobs no one wants to do. This takes care of that and says that we actually care about our workers. The second thing I would do, and it's a little bit tied to the living wage, is raise the poverty line. Right now, the poverty line is around $20,000 or so for a family of four. Now that's ridiculous. That's less than scrapping by to survive. Essentially, one thing goes wrong. One thing, and that family is screwed. There's no way they're coming back. The poverty line is way too low. The economists have done studies on actual living standards and cost of living, and even bare-bones survival. I mean, obviously, they don't deserve to get government compensation that makes them more comfortable than those who work really have these really high tier jobs. But even if you raise the poverty line to 40, 50,000, I think that would be good, because at the end of the day, most economists estimates the cost of living range from at the bottom level, at survival level. If you include everything, a family of four needs 50 to 80,000 to survive, and I'm talking to survive. And so 20,000 is extremely low. It's around 20,000, not exactly, but it's still extremely low. And what if I made just $1,000 over that? Oh, I'm suddenly not poor. That's a ridiculous argument. So around 30 to 40,000, I think, would be a good way to help those lower off. And if they have more money, again, they can spend or save that money which goes into the economy in one way or the other. So those are two. So far, I've offered two suggestions. One is institute a living wage, and the second being raise the poverty line. Now, the third is more of a long term solution. The living wage, I mean, politically, it's going to be hard to pass, but theoretically, if you could get it passed, it could take effect right away. So it's more of a short term solution, but it does have long term good positive impacts. Poverty, raising the poverty line is going to take some time, but it's still more of a short to mid term. Now, the third thing I'm suggesting is more of a mid to long term solution. And I think this goes to a little bit of different areas, but I think it's important in how capital is affecting labor markets, how to compensate for that, is alternative education. Now, what do I mean by that? There's this idea that everyone has to go to college and college and college, but we've seen that's not working. The cost of college is increasing, and simply having a sheet of paper doesn't mean anything. What I'm finding more and more from personal experience, as well as like general economic data, is that employers are looking more for people with experience. And so it doesn't matter if I have a bachelor's, master's, even a PhD. I'm going to have to need some experience. And so we're pushing people into college without getting them real street smarts and relevant work experience. So what I would suggest is there's actually good paying jobs that are actually pretty like not labor intensive, but they don't require a degree, but more something like vocational training. Things like locksmiths, plumbers. These people get paid a good deal of money. If you don't believe me, look up the average salary of like a standard plumber or a locksmith, and you'd be surprised. Believe me, going to get certification for that is a hell of a lot cheaper than going to college. And yet you get paid just as good, if not better. And I was actually looking at economic data. I mean, even though these are they're jobs that existed for a long time. I wouldn't even call them lower tier. Things like carpenter, locksmith, plumber, electrician. They sound so trivial, but they're always in demand. They've been in demand for ages, and they will continue to be so, and they're not going to go out of supply. I mean, the supply is relatively low, so there's so much job opportunities there. And so that's what I mean by alternative education. People trying alternative path routes. Allow people to work after they graduate high school. Allow people to get training in these other fields rather than just go to a traditional college. I'm not saying people can't get an education. I'm saying people should get an education in different ways. Education isn't just going to a particular school or going to a four-year university. It could mean getting training in how to be a locksmith. It could mean getting work experience right outside of high school. And I think we want a well-rounded. I think the problem is we're trying to create a well-rounded workforce, but we're pushing everyone towards college. So those are contradictory. Those are contradictory views on how we should proceed. I think if we really want a well-rounded workforce, and that's what we really need, we need to push people in different directions. There are plenty of people that need to go to college, and college is something that's going to be helpful for a lot of people. But at the same time, a lot of people don't need it or should do something alternatively, like a vocational school, a training school, a trade school, something like that. And with today's information age, we can actually use capital. Even though it's hurting the labor market, we can kind of turn it around. We need people. There's a lot of online courses people can take. People can get skills by practicing, looking at online tutorials. And so we need to incorporate that more into the general workforce and allow people to get work experience and get alternative training and education outside of the traditional four-year college model, because that doesn't seem to be working, and it's only in college prices are only increasing in the near future. So that's what I would suggest. Those three things: institute a living wage, raise the poverty line, and stress alternative education, and also provide some incentives for people to do that, so that there's a well-rounded workforce. So I'm basically just gonna do a brief recap, right? Recap. I'm gonna do a brief recap right here of what I've been talking about. So I've been talking about how capital affects the labor market, and how, unlike in the past, capital is actually hurting middle class workers, as well as middle tier and top tier jobs, because of things like software and just general technology. And so it's very hard for white collar workers to get alternative education if they're already 30, 40, 50, and it's pushing a lot of people to get these low paying jobs because they need them, and wages are being driven down, and even in the high tier markets like scientists and doctors, those are becoming more competitive. So in order to compensate for that, I suggested that we institute a living wage at around $11 to $13, raise the poverty line at least to 30, 40,000, and stress alternative education, which means putting people in trade schools, putting them in vocational training, getting them experience right out of high school, and focusing on people doing things other than four-year colleges that are relevant to them becoming better people and helping in the workforce. Oh, and I'd like to actually stress a fourth thing I just thought about, and that's wow, I just forgot. I think I feel like Rick Perry, but at least I wasn't talking about it the whole time. Um, it was here it is. I didn't forget it. Internship should be paid. It's basically doing a minimum wage job, and yet you don't get any money. That's stupid. You should get the minimum wage now, and under my plan, a living wage. You're doing just as much work, if not anyone else. I'll just give you a real world example. At my work, there's an intern there. She does basically roughly the exact same work I do. I get paid, she doesn't, and I feel a little bit unfair about that. Granted, like it's like a youth and government thing, and it's a little different, but still, people should get paid for internships. Come on, it's basically a job, and yet you're not getting paid, and you're doing things sometimes no one else wants to do. It's unfair. Oh, and I guess the last thing, but I guess this goes without saying, is respect everyone's work for the most part. I mean, we look down upon people who like are a carpenter or maybe a waiter, but everyone's trying to get by. Everyone's been in a rough spot, so just respect everyone. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. There are a few gaffes I made, but this is all one take. So gotta give me a break. This video is pretty long, over 17 minutes. So have a great day. Hopefully you take these lessons into advice, and more importantly, hopefully lawmakers, though I doubt any of them watch my blog, will learn from this and realize that in order to have a good economy, you need to respect the people who make the economy what it is, and that means helping those from the very bottom to mid-tier and up-tier, and treating everyone with respect. So thanks for watching. This is more of an economics-based video, and this has been the Patelian Model blog, and this is done by Alex Patel. Peace.